At this time, I'd like to turn the floor over to Gary Bossert. Gary, you have the floor.
Thank you, Greg, and good morning, and thank you for everyone for attending today's webinar. I am Gary Bossert, Vice President of Operations for Curie Benefit Solutions and the NCMS Plan. Before beginning today's presentation, on behalf of Curie Benefit Solutions and our attorney panelists from Nelson Mullins, we want to thank you for the vital work you have done and continue to do for your patients and the communities that you serve. As millions of workplaces reopen, employees from universities and restaurants to retail shops and medical practices are likely afraid to go back to work and don't know what to do about it. Labor advocates say most workers fear a perfect storm, exhausting their unemployment benefits, needing to return to work to pay the bills, and wondering whether they will be safe in the workplace if safety guidelines are voluntary rather than mandatory. Meanwhile, business advocates say the economy cannot wait on delivery of a COVID vaccine and that commerce must resume, with employers and workers addressing the hazards of coronavirus according to guidelines from the CDC. Effective Friday, May 22nd, North Carolina moved into Safer at Home Phase 2 of lifting COVID restrictions. The continued increases in daily counts signals a need to take any further steps forward cautiously. Yesterday, Governor Cooper announced that Phase 2 restrictions would remain in place until at least Friday, July 17th, and that face coverings must be worn when people are in public places. As leaders in your practice, we know you are anxious to return to normal operations and also want to take full advantage of the financial relief programs available to you. This webinar, Overcoming COVID-19's Impact on Your Workforce, will guide you through the myriad financial relief programs and provide a roadmap for return to work best practices. We are fortunate to have two attorneys from law firm Nelson Mullins with us today, Ann Murray and Lauren Nations. Ann is a partner in Nelson Mullins' Atlanta office where she practices in the areas of employee benefits and executive compensation. She is a member of her firm's healthcare team, which focuses on providing comprehensive services to hospitals, physician practices, and other healthcare providers. Ann assists her clients with all types of HR and benefits-related matters, including those related to qualified retirement plans and health benefits. Lauren is a member of Nelson Mullins' tax and benefits team and assists clients with all types of employee benefits, executive compensation, and employment law matters. Prior to earning her law degree, Lauren worked as an HR professional, which allows her to better understand the challenges faced by clients in dealing with employment and benefits issues. I want to thank you both for presenting today. Ann and Lauren, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Gary. This is Ann Murray, and I realize that for many of the folks that are on this call, you're not really reopening. You're continuing to operate the best that you can because you've been on the front lines of a lot of this pandemic. So we're going to try and talk and skew this conversation around, your particular circumstances and the fact that, even when we talk about reopening as we continue through our presentation, keep in mind we'll talk about it as reopening or continuing operations in this new, what I hate to say is the norm, So with that, let's go ahead and move to our first topic.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren. I'm happy to talk to you again. And the first topic we're going to address is maximizing your monetary relief. Always important in this strange economy that's going on. Ann?
Yes, and we realize that for many of you, you may not have taken advantage of some of these tax credits and other relief that's out there. You may have thought that it wouldn't be necessary, but you may be finding in recent weeks or the past month that perhaps things aren't progressing the way you thought they would. So that's the reason that we wanted to start out this presentation with just a brief overview of the different relief that is out there to make sure that if it's something that might help you, the kind of door is closing soon on some of it, and so we want to make sure it's at least, at the forefront of your thoughts. The first is the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act, FFCRA. This was the paid Sick and Emergency Family Medical Leave Act leave that was issued, wow, it's been several months now. What's important to note is that the FFCRA paid leave, probably a lot of you elected out of providing this leave to a good portion of your employee population because you do not have to provide the leave to healthcare providers. However, because that is an employee-by-employee determination, we're going to go ahead and just highlight some of the tax credits that are available here. Also note, if you have 50 or fewer employees, there actually is fewer than 50, not 50 or fewer than 50 employees, there is a separate opt-out where you can choose to not provide the paid leave to your employees if you could show that it would affect your ability to continue as a going concern. But just as an overview, FFCRA paid leave, this was the first available April 1st of 2020, but it will last through the end of this year. So if you are subject to this, it's a continuing obligation you need to keep in mind. If you have temporary employees who are jointly employed with another employer, like you use a PEO or employee leasing company, or you bring in temps, even if you're not currently using them, if maybe you'll use them later on this year, you have to count all those employees. Both entities actually have to count those employees, so it's something to just keep in mind. Part-time employees are entitled to this leave, but for our purposes today, what we want to focus on is if you are providing this leave, remember that you're able to claim tax credits. You should be claiming those each payroll period against the employment taxes that you are paying. It's a refundable tax credit, so if for any reason the amount you pay out in any payroll period or quarter exceeds the employment taxes that you would otherwise owe, there's actually a method for you to request a direct refund from the federal government. So that's something that's unique. And if you are paying out these paid leaves, make sure that you're retaining the appropriate records to show that people requested this leave for the qualifying reasons, but also make sure and get with your payroll provider, make sure that you are submitting for all of the available tax credits that you can receive through these. Okay, moving to the next slide, let's talk about Paycheck Protection Act.
Yeah, so there's been a lot in the news, these past several months about the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP loans, and so you're probably familiar with those, or at least a little bit familiar. That the biggest advantage of these is that you can get the loan fully forgiven if you use the funds for qualifying expenses, and they define those qualifying expenses as payroll costs, mortgage interest, rent, and utilities. The issue is that you need to make sure you use those funds for these expenses to get them forgiven. And earlier this month, on June 5th, they passed the Payroll Protection Flexibility Act, which they did that in an effort to make it easier for you to qualify for this forgiveness. So in the past, it was your proportion of payroll costs that you used from these funds. As long as you spent 75% of those funds to cover those costs, you would get forgiveness. If you didn't, your forgiveness would be reduced. They've now lowered that to 60% to make it a little bit easier to use these funds. They've also extended the period over which you must use these funds. It was 8 weeks, and now it's 24 weeks. You have a little bit longer to try to use those funds and take advantage of that. The Flexibility Act also provided some safe harbors. So if your business was unable to return to the level that it was pre-COVID due to having to comply with health and safety guidelines, you can take advantage of a safe harbor to try to obtain that forgiveness.
And if you take a loan that's less than $2 million, there is an automatic deemed need, so you don't have to actually technically have a business need for the loan. You're automatically deemed to be in need because you are a small business.
Right, because that's a lot of what came up in the beginning was a lot in the press about how a lot of big corporations got these loans and small mom and pops weren't able to get them. And what the program requires you to do is to certify that the loan is necessary to support your ongoing operations and that you will use those funds to retain your employees and keep their wages up. But like Ann said, now if your loan is $2 million or less, you're automatically assumed to have met that good faith requirement.
Right. So the important point here is if you are a business that perhaps didn't think that you needed it or you were worried about whether or not you qualified as having a need, the loan application deadline expires June 30th. The money is not used up. In fact, there's a lot of available money still out there. So if you do believe that this is something that you would be interested in applying for, certainly reach out to the bankers with whom you work. I know that several of the online sources like Cabbage with a K, they're going out into the market and really trying to push before June 30th to get people to apply because the money's out there. It's completely forgivable if you can, satisfy the requirements, and it's certainly something that I think that to myself, I don't know what you're finding with clients, Lauren, but, I have a lot of clients who've said, we kind of took it, set it aside. We'd rather repay it and have it there to rely on for the coming 24 weeks than to find ourselves in a bind.
Exactly.
So something to consider.
Yeah. So as far as what you need to be doing now, if you have already received that loan or you're planning on getting into the loan process, make sure you're identifying and tracking the cost to help maximize your loan forgiveness. I did see several sources online where they have these spreadsheets that you can track, how you've used that money every pay period. So that you can then, when you fill out your loan forgiveness application, which is also now available online, it's easier if you'd already have that documentation in place. So.
Okay, now let's talk about the employee retention credit. The employee retention credit is another available tax credit for you. It used to be that if you took a PPP loan, the loans that we were just talking about, you could not also take the employee retention credit. Recent guidance and recent changes to the law were issued where you can now both receive a forgivable PPP loan or forgiveness of your PPP loan and apply for this employee retention credit. So here's the basic requirements for a employee retention credit. Basically, each calendar quarter, you can take a credit for 50% of what they call qualified wages that you pay if your operations were fully or partially suspended due to a COVID-19 shutdown order from a governmental authority, or your gross receipts declined by more than 50% when you compare them to the same quarter in the prior year. So especially if you're a healthcare provider who perhaps is primarily focused on elective procedures, this may very well apply to you. If you qualify, then each calendar quarter, actually each payroll period in the quarter, and then at the end of the quarter on your quarterly employment tax return, you'll be able to take a credit. The credit's capped at the first $10,000 of comp per employee. That includes health plan expenses. But if you are someone who's impacted or has been impacted either from the government closure orders or, you're just because you do a lot of, let's say, elective procedures, investigate these employee retention credits because they're available through the end of this year, and they began as early as March 13th of 2020. So you still have the ability to retroactively go back and amend your employment tax return for the first quarter. And we're coming up on the end of the second quarter here, so you may want to be working with your payroll company to make sure that you're taking advantage of these credits, because that can add up quickly.
And something else the government has provided is the ability to delay the payment of Social Security taxes. And This includes those who have applied for the loan forgiveness. However, once the bank issues a decision that your loan has been forgiven, you're no longer eligible to continue to defer at that time. But you're still able to take what you have deferred up until that decision date, and you still have a longer time to pay it. So as indicated on the slide, 50% is due at the end of next year, and then the other 50% is due in 2 years. So this allows you to delay the payment of the employer's share of Social Security taxes, not including the Medicare tax portion is at 1 point something percent, that you would otherwise owe this year. So just kind of you can offset that for the time being, which is pretty helpful, I think.
Okay, so now let's move to reopening or continuing your operations. I think what's important for everyone to recognize here is that, by the beginning of June, we had over 1,000 lawsuits had been filed in the U.S. related to COVID-19 pandemic. So, as your business continues its operations, or if you're one of those that closed for a while and has reopened, you need to make sure that all the decisions and actions that you're taking are deliberate, thoughtful, geared towards ensuring the safety of your employees and patients and vendors that come in. So some of the focus that we're going to talk about is how do you show that so that you're building, I hate to say it, but this is a litigious society, and your communications, your policies, all of those could come into a court of law if someone, an employee or a patient, were to sue you. And so you want to basically have everything well documented and put in place to give you the best defense. And remember, and we've talked about this in so many other areas of the law, as you talk with others within your organization about what you should be doing, or if an employee maybe has been exposed to COVID-19, communications in this day and age in litigation, all your emails are discoverable. Yeah. So, think defensively when you're talking via email, especially since so many people are teleworking or, on altered or staggered shifts. Remember, emojis may not be the best thing to be using. It might be better to pick up the phone or talk, or video chat than to put everything in email. Just, this is the lawyer side of us, but think defensively. It's important at this point.
There's several topics that go along with continuing your operations or reopening, which we'll go over, including the physical operations, what you need to do to the physical workspace, any screening and testing. We'll have a lot to probably say about that. Cleaning and disinfection protocols, working conditions, PPE, as Ann mentioned, employee communications. Those are a big deal right now, as well as managing employee leaves of absence related to COVID-19 and returning to work after they may have come down with the illness. Ann?
So talking about your physical operations and access, first, you really need to, for those of you that perhaps have not had to close, but rather have remained open through all of this, it's a good time as we move along through this pandemic. Guidance is coming out daily, if not weekly. It seems like there was a little lull, did you notice, Lauren, for the last few weeks, and then all of a sudden, in the last week or so, we've got new OSHA guidance, new CDC guidance. Everybody's coming out with more guidance. So if you maybe worked on some of your COVID-19 policies and procedures back in April or May, they may not be current or totally compliant now. So it's just a good time, make sure that you're going back periodically and updating. If you made initial communications with your employees, then go back and you may need to update them on what you're doing now that, for example, North Carolina is in phase 2. Perhaps your first communication was back during phase 1. Make sure everybody's on board and that you can show that you're communicating with your employees regularly. If you haven't sent anything out to your employees, then I suggest that you do, just with an update. if nothing more, for reassurance. As Gary said at the beginning, so many employees are even in the health field where they know, the reality of everything. They're scared or things are unclear for them, so they need more communication rather than less. Testing and screening, we're going to talk about a bit more of that on the next slide, but that's certainly something that is very important, and we've had some recent guidance on what you can and can't do. Same with information gathering. It's very important to remember whatever you gather through this process needs to remain confidential, and you need to keep it separate and apart from your employee personnel files. You need to make sure that you have policies that have been communicated to your employees about reporting illnesses, and that you're putting in place processes where if someone believes they've been exposed or they have been diagnosed, that they know what the phone number is they're supposed to call or the email, and not to come into the workplace. Entrances to your facility, whether you're in a larger building or and just a tenant, or you're in a standalone building, it's really important that you have, and we'll talk about this in some of the future slides, that you've got the appropriate hand sanitizers, and you've got signage that tells people what to do and where to go. That employees, if there's a designated door that they, I blanked on the word door that they should be using versus your patients coming in a different, a different access point. That's important that you've got that documented, because that's just one more thing that helps to show you're taking steps to kind of separate people. Your visitors and the general public, when we talk about public, we're talking, in most cases about your patients. The signage and the separate entrance is very important. One thing to think about is, how are you limiting others coming with the patients, especially if your population of patients consists of a lot of elderly, and they're coming with caregivers or family members. Are you letting them all in a room together, and how much does that increase your exposure? Very important. What we're seeing is, in most cases, the healthcare providers are taking the view that unless it is absolutely necessary to have that caregiver with the patient, that the caregiver stays outside, literally like outside of your offices, does not enter. But that's certainly something that you've got to have some processes and procedures in place with your employees so they know, when do I make this exception, or who makes the end call for this? And then third-party vendors, obviously now is not the time to have a ton of third-party vendors coming in, but we all know how that works.
Especially in the medical field, I feel like there's always sales professionals trying to come in and sell their latest pharmaceuticals or whatever.
Exactly. So, I think that that's an important area that you make sure that, you're keeping that in mind and not having too many in place.
Regarding employee screening and testing, I know that the North Carolina executive order back in May 20th, that's still effective now. It requires, as you know, that businesses open to the public must conduct daily screening of symptoms using a standard interview questionnaire of symptoms. So you're probably already doing that and have been doing that, which is not only, good to follow the requirements of the order, but also it's good to protect your employees as well as your customers and patients that come on site.
So that would apply to, it should be the same form or similar form, right, for both employees and patients, vendors, anybody that's coming on site?
I believe so, just to make sure you're covering all your bases. And, the biggest thing about having the same standard questionnaire is that you're not asking certain people questions and not others that may be discriminatory, because these always have to be applied in a non-discriminatory manner. So.
And I've seen a lot of apps that have come out. There's an app for everything nowadays. But,
there really is.
But in fact, there's probably a dozen or more companies out there that have these screening processes where you can even have your patients or employees each day go onto this app before they come in, and they answer some questions, perhaps do a temperature reading, and the app sort of uploads and tells you whether or not that person has, satisfied the requirements. So.
And there's a lot of benefit, because that's one question employers ask is, if I do this on the work site, do I have to pay non-exempt employees for the time they spend waiting? Our general advice is if it's less than 5 minutes that they spend waiting to take the test and waiting for their results, if you require them to have a pass, on the symptom check, that time, if it's more than 5 minutes, is compensatory or included in hours worked. But that's another good reason to do it at home is that, they're doing it at home, they're not on site. Also, you've prevented them from coming into the work site and being sick. If they are sick, they're already still at home. So those are some pretty interesting situations. What has been updated regarding these employee screening and testing is that with the Americans with Disabilities Act, these screening and testing used to be or are still considered a medical examination, which can only be required if it's job-related and consistent with business necessity. But the EEOC has now said that, because of the community spread of COVID and, how we need to stop the spread, employers are permitted to issue these these employee screenings.
So to make them mandatory for everyone.
Yeah, exactly, as long as non-discriminatory. But like Ann was saying earlier, you do have a lot of confidentiality obligations, so we recommend that you try to keep the whole screening process as private as possible. And, of course, if anyone has a positive test or a temperature, you need to keep their identity confidential, which is always difficult for employers because then you need to let the coworkers know that they may have been in contact with this person. And it's kind of like you can't say their name, but people kind of figure out who it is if you're in a small office.
Especially if you're small.
Yeah. Exactly.
And what about questions that they can ask? I mean, is it, so I ask whether or not someone has symptoms. What about, hey, do you have any family members or do you have a history where you're more susceptible? Can I ask all of those things if I'm an employer?
And also if they've been to a high-risk area, there's still some of those that, of course, it seems to change now. Georgia has become, and North Carolina have become high-risk areas, it seems like. But, you can ask them about possible exposure situations, and you do want to know if they're in a high-risk category. You can't require them to tell you, though, right, Ann? I mean, that's what we've researched recently is that because it's dealing with their medical history, they can't be required to tell you, yes, I'm older than 65, or if you don't already know that, if they're your employee, you probably would because you have access to their date of birth. But just certain high-risk questions, if they don't want to tell you, they
and you certainly can't ask about family traits or family members having. You can ask if they've been exposed if they're aware that they've been exposed among their family members or friends, but you can't because of we always have issues on whether or not you can make employees indicate whether or not a family member has certain conditions, and so that's something that you need to steer away from.
And if they are, their screening does reveal either, that they've been exposed to someone that has had COVID, or they have a high temperature, or they're having any symptoms of the virus, you can, prohibit them from entering the work site. That's why we recommend if you're going to do these screenings at work, you do it kind of in the very front of the office before they've come in contact with other employees and patients. You can require them to work remotely if that's an option for their job,
which
isn't always. A lot of times it's not, and that they self-monitor their temperature and give you a daily report. If they're at work, and we'll talk about, I think the isolation area comes up a little bit later, so I'll hold off on that. But as far as record keeping, if that's an OSHA requirement, as far as if the employee caught the virus at work or while performing work-related activities, that's an injury or illness that's required to be reported on OSHA Form 300. And there's recently been some clarification on what is a work-related injury. And so OSHA has now said that, it's likely someone contracted the virus at work if several cases have developed among close coworkers and there's no other explanation. Or they've been exposed after a close encounter with a patient or a coworker that has the virus. So, the determination of work-related, it can sometimes be difficult, but based on the situation, it may be a little bit easier to where you need to record and report that to OSHA.
Talking about recent guidance, so temperature checks we know clearly are okay to require. What about more invasive testing or, antibodies testing?
Yeah. Well, that's when the EEOC has recently, and that's the good thing is these agencies are issuing guidance because there's just been so many questions these past 3 months. So even though it's kind of onerous to have to keep up with the daily guidance that's being issued from all these different agencies, it is helpful because, for example, like I said, the EEOC has recently said that employers can't require antibody testing.
So cannot.
Cannot, right. That you can't say, before the employees come to work, we have to test them to see if they've had the virus. That can't be required, cannot be required.
Got it. Okay, well, let's talk about sanitation protocols. Always has such an interesting sound to it. But, this is so important. I mean, I think for healthcare providers, this is already something that is part of your everyday to begin with. But this past week, the Department of Labor, the OSHA, issued new recommendations called what they call guidance on returning to work, which details how they expect, in this case, non-essential businesses to develop and implement their plans. But what's interesting is I still think that it's helpful even for you, who most of you are, if not all, essential businesses. This guidance that's been issued is still, I think, still helpful to tell you what OSHA expects you to be putting in place as far as your different protocols. I mean, they've got a 3-phase strategy, and they really, basically, they emphasize the need for employers to develop and implement strategies for basic hygiene, hand hygiene, cleaning, disinfection, the stuff you guys do all the time, but the social distancing, the identifying and isolating sick employees, having workplace controls and flexibilities, having employee training. And so OSHA expects to see everyone have a written plan and procedures in place for hazard assessment, hygiene, social distancing, identification and isolating sick employees, returning to work after illness or exposure, controls like engineering and administrative controls, possibility of sick leave versus telework, and then training. Training is what everyone seems to be focusing on. Oh, and never forget the anti-retaliation.
Right.
Whatever you put in place, you want to make sure that it ends with a discussion of the fact that you will not retaliate against any employee for exercising their rights. But at the same time that OSHA's come out with that guidance, and if you go to the OSHA site, there is so much guidance and policies and documents and checklists that are intended to assist you with putting in place all these different policies. I mean, if you haven't already done this and you don't already have some written infectious disease preparedness and response plan, or whatever you want to call it, we really encourage you and emphasize that you should be putting something in place. Your standard policies are probably not enough in this day and age, and you should make sure that you're putting in place something that is more specific to COVID.
Right, and we've seen that, under OSHA, the employees have the ability to make a report to the administration, and they may initiate an investigation just to see. And it may start, I think now OSHA has said that they're going to do kind of like a remote inspection. You'll have to maybe provide some documents, but that, like Ann was saying, these wellness plans, as we call them here at our firm that we've developed, they're going to be key for you to show that you've done your duty to have a safe workplace.
Yeah.
And those are also going to be important as you recall employees who you may have had this happen where they're just not comfortable coming back to work. We have a client like that right now, and they're still, dealing with getting him to come back to work. But we have been able to show that we've got these guidelines to show that we've done the sanitation, we've done the training, social distancing, things like that. But you need something to support that you have made your workplace as safe as you reasonably can. So as far as working conditions, you want to, like I said, do what you can to make your workspace as virus avoidant, that's a good word, as possible. And you've probably already started implementing some of these strategies where, separating offices where possible. It's funny that, these past several years, we've seen a lot of workspaces that are just open and everyone kind of shares a desk. Those aren't the way to go right now.
But it's difficult for a healthcare provider, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you are in somewhat close quarters when you're behind the counter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So just keep that in mind, and then always the 6 feet rule. Try to keep people as socially distant as possible. Regarding infrastructure, OSHA has got good guidance on increasing ventilation and air filters just to kind of get the air as clean as possible. You may want to consider staggering schedules or days with your workers, just to limit the number of people that are in an office at one time, if you can.
Especially someone clerical.
Yeah.
Certainly that's not going to work for your nurses and doctors, but
maybe they can come in at night.
But it makes sense.
Yeah. If you have the ability to have your employees telecommute or remote work, again, in the medical practice, that's maybe not very feasible because you have to see the patients on site. But you got the teledoc, appointments, which are an easier way to do that. As Ann mentioned earlier, limit visitors where possible, as well as third-party vendors. We usually recommend with the vendors and visitors, unless they've been invited on site, to kind of limit them coming. And if they do, they still have to abide by the same, safety guidelines that you've set up for your employees.
So personal protective equipment is a very important one in the healthcare field, certainly. The CDC has come out with a lot of detail. If you go to their website, they deal with everything from, how to handle all of the various PPE. They've got some supplemental guidance on if your particular practice has workers who are at an increased risk of exposure, they've got steps that you should be taking. They even have charts that break the hazards down and sort of go into a lower, medium, high, and very high risk categories. And then they tell you, for example, you're at medium risk if you're providing care to the general public who are not known or suspected to have COVID-19, whereas you would be in high risk if you're entering a known or suspected COVID-19 patient's room. And so then based on what category you fall into, then the guidance basically goes through engineering controls, meaning partitions or physical barriers that you should have in place, administrative controls like should you isolate suspected cases separately from confirmed cases. If possible, you should. And then safe work practices, things like, perform as many tasks as possible away from the patient. We used to always emphasize in the healthcare side of things being in the room with the patient, and rolling in the computer equipment and typing everything in front of the patient, because that was just, that's what we were all moving to, right? Whereas now, that is not what's recommended, because it just means that you're spending more time in the room and there's more things that are potentially getting exposed, right? So, the concepts under the safe work practices are, work from the clean to the dirty, and so you have increasing, so you're not spreading the germs or not as likely. And then once again, they focus on training and retraining. So, on the PPE, it's really important that you show that you are training and have retrained your personnel on, how they're putting them on, how they're taking them off. I know that in the healthcare field this is, we all know this.
Right.
But thinking defensively from a litigation perspective, like I said, there's already well over 1,000 cases filed or lawsuits that have been filed. Who knows when they'll all get in the courts, since the courts aren't open. But, it's important to make sure you're documenting everything. Look at your different positions and, who should or shouldn't, have additional or heightened, PPE. What is everyone wearing gloves? Is everyone not? We know everyone needs to be wearing the, certainly the face mask, but, are they the P95 or is it, something less for your reception group or your clerical? All of that, I think that it's good that you document sort of your decisions. Hey, we met, we decided this, here's the groups and where we've broken each of the groups down.
One thing I saw that was interesting is the CDC, they have, just like OSHA, a dedicated page for COVID-19 and healthcare professionals. One thing on their website they have is a PPE burn rate calculator, which will help you plan the use of your PPE, showing you how much you're going through and when you may need to order more. So that may be something you want to check out if you haven't already, just to make sure you have what you need.
Yeah,
that's
really useful.
That was helpful. Yeah.
I mean, granted, I even saw in the grocery store the other day, selling masks. I mean, it's become, you think about how freaked out everybody was when everything started.
Right.
And, no one could find a mask. Now, granted, those are not, I venture to say those are not compliant,
yeah,
if you're in the healthcare industry, but it's certainly amazing how fast the world has changed now.
Has adapted, for sure. So as we mentioned earlier, training is very important right now, because it's one thing to develop these policies, but if you don't actually train your workforce on what's expected of them, it's not really going to help. So, either prior to employees coming back to work or as on an ongoing basis as you continue to be open, just inform them of any workplace operating procedure changes, such as the plans that you have for social distancing, sanitation, hand hygiene, topics like that. It's recommended by OSHA that you do require their attendance and participation, not necessarily in person, because we're trying to limit congregations of people, but OSHA does recommend that the training is offered during their scheduled work time and at no cost to the employee. So make sure you keep that in mind when you're scheduling these. Some of the topics during training that you should go over, again, your new guidelines. Make sure your employees are aware of the risk factors, such as, the sources of exposure, although I would think it would be safe to say most people in the medical field are pretty aware of the risks, and just what the emergency procedures are for your workplace. I also wanted to mention something helpful on OSHA's website. They have a training and reference materials library, which, as Ann said, has got all kinds of materials that you may find helpful with your putting together your training packages. Yeah,
even handouts. They've got how to put on and take off PPE, and a lot of things that you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Right. Thank goodness.
Or pay outside consultants for. That's certainly something that's all available.
And that way you don't miss anything too. Everything's pretty much there. So.
Right. I think better when the government gives you documents or forms such as that, how to put on, take off. I think that it's a good idea to use what they have, because they have a much harder time faulting, the communications that you put out there. Okay, handling employee illnesses at work. This is a tough one, and it really depends on your size, on what you're going to do to handle an employee who says that they are ill. But certainly, if the employee comes in and indicates that they have symptoms, I mean, since we are talking about the healthcare field and you do have patients that are likely coming into your facility, it's more important than ever that they be isolated, if not sent immediately off property. That's just, and there's certainly nothing wrong with doing that. The CDC guidance suggests that you should have some isolation room. If you have a patient, room that's available, or you can set aside and designate, that would be where the person could go. You have supplies in there so that they can be checked out. Some protocol or what I mean policy or procedure that kind of sets forth, okay, if someone does have symptoms, and here's where what Lauren was talking about with training becomes important. Okay, everyone gets their training. If you have symptoms, go to this room, call so-and-so, call Sally. Sally knows to, come in with her proper PPE equipment. She collects what she needs to, but also coordinates, let's say, getting assistance to you to get home if you need it, or transportation, and doing the proper reporting if the OSHA 300 form needs to be filled out, and making sure that once you leave the isolation facility, and making sure you don't come in contact with patients or others when you're leaving, but also once you leave, then that person also coordinates and makes sure that it's disinfected, because who knows when the next person comes in.
Right.
Could be an hour, could be a week, but all of those processes are part of what the CDC and EEOC want to see in place in your preparedness plan.
One thing I was going to mention when we were talking about screening, don't think that you have to have a medical professional to do those screenings or do the temperature checks. I mean, it can be a non-medical person as long as they've been properly trained on how to conduct the screening.
So someone from HR, even though you have nurses and doctors available, someone from HR can do it.
Yeah, because, I mean, the agencies understand that right now you don't want to pull the medical professionals away from patient care, right now, to do things like temperature checks.
Yeah, good point.
So, regarding the leave management for employee illness, probably the biggest thing to keep in mind here is to try to, your current leave policies, be as flexible as possible as you can with them, just so that employees aren't, the worst situations where you have employees who they don't have any, they either aren't aware of their leave that's available under the law, which we're about to talk about, or they don't have any paid time off, and they come to work sick because they don't have any paid time off. And that's the last thing you want. So just make sure they're aware of what leave is available for them, and if you can be flexible in giving them leave, you should probably do so. So there's different types of leaves that are available to them, whether it's your group's paid time off policy. As far as FMLA leave, the EOC has said that, or I think it's the EOC, maybe it's the Department of Labor who interprets the FMLA, that flu-like symptoms such as from COVID, if the complications rise to the level of a serious health condition, you may be eligible for FMLA leave related to those complications. So that may be an option. As Ann mentioned earlier, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act provides some 2 weeks of paid sick leave in certain situations related to COVID, as well as, some expanded family and medical leave, and there may be some state leave laws that also come into play depending on where you're located. So just, again, when you're doing your leave management, just make sure that, you're not discriminating and giving leave to certain employees on an unequal basis as to other employees, and, of course, don't retaliate against anyone for exercising their leave rights.
So if you do have an employee who has, gone out because they've been diagnosed with COVID, what do you do as far as returning them to work? You are allowed to ask, certainly when they return to work, whether you can ask whether or not they need, for instance, reasonable accommodations. The ADA, remember that the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act continue to apply, even though, you may view yourself, we're an essential workforce and somehow exempted from a lot of these rules, but you still do have the ADA applying to you. Now, on return to work, you can ask someone when they're returning to work, you can ask disability-related inquiries, provided they're job-related and based on business necessity. And if you look at the CDC's website, they've got some guidance there, but you need to take into consideration the employee's rights under Title VII and the ADA. When you're requiring, let's say, that they wear protective gear, such as, like, if you have someone who, for religious reasons, wears certain, clothing or articles, you need to consider that when they're returning. And actually, this applies across the board, just in your PPE usage in general. You can request that the employee, you can basically say in your policies that the employee must request or notify you of their need for any type of additional accommodations when they return. If they don't request one, then the ADA says you don't have to provide one. There's a lot of guidance out there, and like I said, certainly visit the CDC website as well as the Department of Labor for potential accommodations that might be needed. I think that it's important to note that when you do have employees who are out, you can require someone to produce a doctor's note that certifies that you are fit to return to work. It's not a disability-related violation or question there. You cannot, similar to what Lauren was talking about, you cannot require an employee to take an antibody test as a condition to return to work because the antibody tests sort of go above and beyond. They're considered a medical examination under the ADA. Whatever you receive from the employee related to their return to work, even though this is a return to work and not something necessarily that is within your health plan, it's still important to keep that information confidential. I would not put it in their normal payroll personnel file. I would make sure that you're keeping it in separate files.
One thing I wanted to mention real quick to go back to, because I know we're running out of time here and we're almost finished, was just that when an employee calls in, this is regarding the screening that we talked about earlier, when an employee calls in sick to work, you are allowed to ask them if it's related to COVID and those kind of COVID screening questions that you have. That is permitted. So just keep that in mind. But on the next slide, we have linked to our website where we have a massive amount of COVID-19 resources. Our firm has done a really good job across several different practice areas. There's probably 20 practice areas on this page that it takes you to. And within each practice area, we have resources available, past and future webinars, breaking news, some additional resources. So there's just a lot of information out there. So hopefully from our website, it's organized into a little bit easier to digest fashion.
Okay, and I think we've reached the point where it's question time if we have any questions that are available.
We do. We've got 5 questions so far, but anybody who has not entered their question into the Q&A panel, you can please do so as we go through the questions. And also, we are making available a copy of the slides, so you can go ahead and download those on your screen, from your screen as we are going through the questions. So the first question, this goes back to the first part of the presentation regarding maximizing the financial relief. So the question is referencing payroll costs and whether payroll costs, and I believe this is in reference to the PPP on slide 4, whether that includes benefits, profit sharing, benefits other than just actual payroll and wages.
Yes, so payroll costs, and I'll go back to that slide. So, I'm sorry, actually, PPP I think was the...
4, yeah, slide 4. There you go. One more.
There we go. So payroll costs that you can claim for purposes of forgiveness of your PPP loan, as well as setting the amount of the PPP loan that you're entitled to, can include any group health plan costs, so your employer portion of premiums if you're fully insured, or insured. The premiums that you pay as an employer, you can take credit for. Remember, the employee's premiums are already kind of counted here because you're counting their gross wages. You're also allowed to take credit for your retirement plan contributions. Now, when we talk about retirement plan contributions, we're talking about those allocable to this particular time period. So for someone who, many on this call may not have yet made your retirement plan contribution for 2019. Maybe you make it after your plan year ends, and thanks to additional extensions we've gotten from the IRS, you haven't had to make it yet. You can't take credit for that contribution you make now for last year's retirement plan. However, you can take credit for what you're paying, with respect to this forgiveness period. So that's important. Now, when you're calculating what the amount of loan is that you're entitled to, that you actually can, if you would basically take into account your look-back period and calculate how much of your retirement plan contribution. For instance, if you make an employer match, what is your employer match for either the 8-week or 24-week forgiveness period? That's what you would include in your calculations. As far as your benefits like life or disability, no, those cannot be the employer payments that you make for those cannot be taken into account. Also note that if you have self-employed individuals, there are special rules that apply, especially if you're a really small provider and let's say it's just you're self-employed. There are some special limits that apply. There's some frequently asked questions that deal with how you calculate retirement plan and group health plan costs for self-employed individuals. And in some cases, you cannot claim them because the view is that your net profits already reflect them, but it's kind of more detailed than we need here.
Well, and payroll costs also, it doesn't include leave costs,
yes.
except for those under the FFCRA that you're taking the credit for.
Correct.
But otherwise, any payments that you make for leave. So, not just payroll, thankfully.
Next question. Ooh, do we have any more questions?
I'm sorry. I was on mute there. I always forget that. That happens a lot these days. Anyway, there's a clarification between the Paycheck Protection Act and the Employee Retention Credit. So on the Employee Retention Credit slide, there's a note that says if you did not repay the Paycheck Protection loan by May 14th, you cannot take the Employee Retention Credit. So the question is whether you can, if you really can take both or not take both. I think just maybe some clarification about that repayment date and the employee retention credit availability.
Oh, yes, I see. Actually, my apologies because the employee retention credit is the one place where you still are prevented from taking the employee retention credit if you receive a PPP loan and did not repay it. So I misspoke earlier because the new guidance that came out said that those that received PPP loans can now delay their Social Security taxes, but it did not change the rule on employee retention credits. You can, unless you repaid your PPP loan, because a lot of people repaid their PPP loans because they got paranoid or worried about whether or not they could really certify that they had a need. And originally, if you repaid those loans, you could not take an employee retention credit. You kind of got the short end of it both ways. They did come out with guidance and said, hey, if you repaid because you were worried about your certification of need, you can now apply for an employee retention credit. But for those of you who got a PPP loan, still have it, and didn't repay it, you do not qualify for the employee retention credit. So I'm so glad you asked that.
Very good. Thank you. And then moving into the next section, the reopening, continuing your operations. Question, I think it came up around slide 10. Lauren, I think you mentioned the availability of some apps for I think like for testing purposes or possibly surveying employees. Or I'm not exactly sure the reference, but there was a question about what apps, if you could name an app in particular that you are aware of, or any apps like that are available that practices might consider.
Yeah, in fact, that would not be a problem. Following the presentation, we'd be happy to provide those to Gary, and he can send them to everybody attending.
Very good.
I know that we certainly have a list of probably 6 or 8 apps that we've had clients run comparisons on and kind of have been at the top of their lists after they've gone through all the available choices. I mean, we can't speak to the individual apps, and recommend one, but we certainly have. We can tell you who's been narrowed down and made the final list.
That'd be great, and I'll make sure to share that with those on the call today. The next question, let's see. The question is, what if an employee's spouse or family member has come into contact with someone who has COVID or is quarantining? Can we ask that they stay home until the second or third party receives their results? So it's kind of like a, second and third party removed from the actual employee. Any answers there?
I believe that would still be permitted, mainly because it's a risk. I mean, if the person's spouse is at home with the employee, or if the employees, they're living together, they're in close contact. So if that person may be exposed, then I would think that the employee could be exposed.
I mean, we're in such a heightened situation here that the guidance that's come out from the EEOC is certainly that you can take a harder stance. And I think given that if your spouse or other family member was exposed and now you've spent time with your spouse or family member, it would be reasonable to expect that, or to require that they get that positive test. Now, sometimes that just may be difficult. I mean, how do they control a third party, right?
Right.
It's
right.
But the solution could be that maybe you have to insist that person go and get a test or monitor their temperature for a period of time.
Yeah. And like I said, as long as you're being reasonable and kind of what your restrictions are, I think that that's generally going to be fine.
Very good. Next question is about forms, and I think this is also a reference to slide 10 and record keeping. I think there was a mention of a form that an employer or practice would complete or file if an employee contracted COVID while at work. Could you talk to that a little bit more about that form and where it would be available?
Yeah, it's the OSHA Form 300, and that's available on the OSHA's website. They have just a template that you can fill out. And then I believe there's certain situations where you must record it, but not necessarily report it. And there's been some moving parts with the reporting process lately.
Yeah, and OSHA's got a good breakdown. In fact, they've got a specific web page that deals with reporting and provides links to the form and everything. So I highly recommend it's very well done.
Mm-hmm. And it's going to be the most up-to-date because, like I said, that reporting requirement, I think, has been a little bit – originally it was only applying to, I think, healthcare professionals like people on the phone, but now it's also now applying to all employers. So, I recommend checking out the OSHA's website and seeing what the latest is on that.
Very good. And then the final question, if an employee has 2 episodes of possible COVID and testing, is it a total 80 hours under the paid sick leave, or is it 80 hours per COVID-related incident?
It is 80 hours total. So they do not get a second bite of the apple, for lack of a better way of putting it.
And it's really not that much time when you think about it. It's kind of surprising, on the employer side. Like, okay, 2 weeks, that's kind of like a vacation.
And it's important to note also when you get to the emergency FMLA leave, if you're giving that, that actually is not in addition to regular FMLA. So, you could have someone who had a baby back in January, and now they've got exposure, and they don't have a right to any additional FMLA. So something to keep in mind. I mean, obviously, the encouragement from the Department of Labor and the other governmental entities is that if you find someone in that circumstance, that you try to work with them as much as possible. But there's certainly no requirement if they already used up their FMLA, using unpaid FMLA back for, let's say, the baby in January. You don't have to give them FMLA, and you definitely don't have to give them paid FMLA. So it's kind of a tough hindsight's 20/20 there.
Yeah, that would just be bad luck for an employee.
All right. Well, that is the end of the questions. Thank you so much to Ann and Lauren for the great information today. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. We will, as we do and have done for, gosh, I don't know how long we've been doing this, Ann, a couple of years at least now. But we will continue to have webinars like this on different topics every quarter. So we look forward to sending out the next invite to you. And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to contact me directly. And thank you again. Have a great day.